Good evening. Welcome back. It is encouraging. It's encouraging to be together, and thank you for being here. Um, we're starting for the rest of the year, which sounds weird, but for the rest of 2022, when we meet together on Sunday nights, we're going to be looking at different Bible characters and situations as they go through their life, where they're at a crossroads, and they've got to make a decision, and that decision is going to literally alter their course of life, or it's going to set them and propel them down a path in which, good or bad, they make decisions. And I was brainstorming with Brittany, and she was like, well, I mean, it's everybody in the Bible. And I was like, yeah, I know. Everybody has crossroads, and everybody has to make those decisions, which I think is why this is so applicable to us, because you can look at nearly any Bible character, and they're going to face an instant or a moment where they make a decision, and it's critical. That it is God-led and God-centered. And if it's not, it turns out for the worst. But as we were thinking about those, we're coming up with brothers. So tonight we're looking at three different brothers who, as they were having interaction with their brothers, they faced critical decisions where they were at a crossroads. And all of those are in Genesis. So I hope you have your Bibles, and I hope you open up to Genesis. And we're going to begin in Genesis chapter 4, of course. Our first brothers, Cain and Abel. Because Cain and Abel, I don't have to retell you the story, but they were at a crossroads, weren't they? Where Cain's jealousy grew, and the righteousness of Abel was verified. And Cain arrives at this instant where he is at a crossroad. Cain is beside himself with jealousy, green with envy, we might say. Why? Why was Cain so angry? It's interesting because as you move through this instance, obviously we kind of see behind the scenes because we have it divinely written for us. So we get a better glimpse perhaps of what was going on than even Cain did, or maybe even Abel did for sure. But Abel brought the fruit of his flock, and he sacrificed it to the Lord. And Cain, in a very similar vein, brought the fruit of the field and sacrificed that to the Lord. Well, obviously, God had regard for the sacrifice of Abel, and the sacrifice of Cain, he did not have any regard. But sometimes, I don't know how or why, we have in verse 4 something that I want to read for you. And it is perfect. Look at this. It is just perfect. And Abel also brought the firstborn of the flock and of their fat portion, and the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain, right? Look at this with me. But for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. And then in verse 6, Genesis chapter 4 and verse 6, the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. The crossroads. Cain is at a crossroads, right? He is at a decision in his life where he has to do something, right? Where he has a decision to make. What do you do? God to Cain, he sees the cogs turning, right, in his mind. And he approaches him and he asks him first a question. He asks him a question, and it's a question, it's like, you've got kids, all right? Everything in my life comes back to the kids now. So you've got kids, and you ask them a question that you already know the answer to. Have you ever done that? Yeah, it's just a natural part of parenting. And if you're a teenager or a kid, your parents have asked you a question that they already knew the answer to, right? They don't necessarily want the answer because they already know the answer to. So God asked Cain this question: why has your face fallen? And why are you angry? Are you not God, right? Don't you know the answer why I am angry? And don't you know why my face has fallen, my countenance? You know why I'm so upset? God knows. But he asked him anyway. And I think, when we ask our children a question, we want them to understand why they are doing it, right? We want them to come to a realization why he is so upset. And this is what I believe, this is why God is asking Cain, Cain, why are you so upset? Why is your face falling? Why are you angry? He wanted Cain to understand, you're just jealous. You're jealous of your brother. You're jealous of his righteous sacrifice, and you're angry with yourself because you didn't sacrifice what was acceptable. So God poses him a question, but it's interesting. At this crossroads, we see God having this conversation with Cain. So God first offers him a question, and then he moves from the question, and he gives them a promise. He gives them a promise, right? The Lord said, Cain, why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? If you do well, there's the promise. If you do well, will you not be accepted? So God still offers him hope, right? Will you not be accepted? Excuse me, a warning. A warning here first. The promise is next. Will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. The warning is that sin is here and it wants you. You see, God sees Cain, and he sees the predicament that he's in. He sees the envy that is festering inside of him, and he sees how he's looking at his brother now, and he gives him this warning as to, you better watch out. Better be careful. When you see your child, let's go back to that child. When you see that child getting close to that hot oven, watch out. Right? You can get there, you can look at it, but watch out, because if you touch it, it's hot. And you're going to burn yourself. It's the warning which is hopefully going to deter the further action. And that's exactly what God is giving Cain. He's giving them a warning. Watch out, because sin is there and it's crouching at the door. And look at it. Its desire is contrary to you. You must rule. Doesn't that remind you? I know it does in my mind of 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. You remember that the devil is described by Peter through inspiration as a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you. And now we have this promise. If you do well, will you not be accepted? Isn't it interesting that God sees the inside and the heart of man, and he sees Cain in his predicament, and he still wants to help? I mean, wasn't it Cain that just offered something that was wrong, something that God detested, and something that God had no regard for? And if God actually loved Cain, shouldn't God have accepted any worship that Cain offered? No. That's not right. That's what the world and many denominations want you to believe, that anything that you do is acceptable to God because God is going to love you. No, God does not necessarily accept anything, but that does not mean that God doesn't still love you, because God still offers him this promise. The promise is, if you do well, will you not be accepted? So we can infer from this promise that he was not doing well. that God had no regard for the sacrifice or the offering because he wasn't doing it right. He didn't have perhaps the right mentality or the right offering, or we could go into a whole host of perhaps reasons as to why, but it doesn't matter. He wasn't doing it well. But even when he wasn't doing it well, God still gave him this promise that if you do it well, I will be with you. Isn't that fascinating? And as a result of all this, we see the literal divine conversation that Cain has with the Lord, and how God is urging him to check his heart. Beside all that, Cain still rises up and kills his brother. And therefore, Cain is forever enshrined, not because of someone who is offering to God, but he is forever enshrined as someone who hates righteous deeds, who hates righteousness. Look at this passage with me very quickly in 1 John as John writes about Cain. He remembers this in 1 John chapter 3, and he writes this: "For this is the message that we have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We should not be like," verse 12, 1 John chapter 3, "we should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother." And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. Do not be surprised, brothers, that the world hates you. Fascinating. Even though God was right there, and even though God was having this conversation, heartfelt warning, promise, and question, and trying to get Cain to do the right thing, Cain still succumbed to evil and temptation, and, as John writes for us, was of the evil one. But through all this, God was right there, and God still wanted him to do the right thing. I find that very, very, very encouraging, at least when I look at myself. So we see the crossroads of Cain in regard to Abel. Let's look at one more. All right, we're still in Genesis. Let's go a few chapters later. A couple more brothers. Jacob and Esau. Amos, who's the hairy man in the Bible? Esau. Jacob and Esau. Let's talk about them real quick, because they had a strained relationship. Let's go to we're going to pick up in about chapter 30. You're familiar with the beginning of their story. Born twins. Jacob held on to the heel, right, of Esau. You talk about a painful childbirth. Wowzers. And for the rest of his life, Jacob, that cheater, Jacob, with his mother's encouragement, stole the birthright. So he was now the heir of 2/3 of the property. Jacob, with the encouragement of his mother all along, not just the birthright, but also the blessing. Esau, the oldest and the firstborn, the one that his father loved more, was left with the younger son's portion and without the blessing. So the story continues. Jacob flees because of the anger of Esau and because of the stealing of the birthright and the blessing. So he flees and he goes and he finds a wife from Laban. You remember the story? And here is this cheater going out and he finds this man, and actually he finds his daughter, you remember. And she was pretty. He works for Laban for 7 years for his younger daughter Rachel. And the deceiver, the cheater, is cheated. And instead of Rachel, gets Leah. So he worked for another 7 years, again for Rachel. 14 years for Rachel. This whole time, Laban's flocks were flourishing because they were under the hand of Jacob and they were growing tremendously. But we arrive at a point in time in chapter 30, Genesis chapter 30, when the relationship between Laban, Rachel, Leah, and Jacob was strained to the point that Jacob, Rachel, and Leah begin to flee from Laban. They flee from their own father. That's where we pick up. So in Genesis chapter 30, here is this man who has pompously, perhaps, maybe arrogantly, and maybe that's not even fair, but he has stolen the birthright of his brother, right? He's stolen the birthright. He's stolen the blessing that was given by Jacob. And he has 2 wives, one that he doesn't necessarily love very much, that is giving him all these children, and one that he loves very much, that is only giving him 2. And now he's on the run for his life, fleeing from Laban because Laban is in hot pursuit. So we pick up in Genesis chapter 30 and we see that Jacob is on the run because he sees Laban coming and he thinks that Laban is about to kill him. Because remember, all the sheep, all the goats, they were producing spotted sheep. They weren't producing what Laban had promised or what Laban wanted. So we come from chapter 31, in Genesis chapter 31. Again, all this is an overview. You're familiar with this story. And then we arrive in Genesis chapter 32. Laban arrives and it's handshakes and hugs. Why did you leave? Okay. But it's interesting, in chapter 32, after that instance, Laban is coming from this way, chasing Jacob. And guess who's coming from this way in chapter 33? Esau. And guess who's right here in the middle in chapter 32? God. Because in chapter 32, you remember this is a famous story where Jacob sends Rachel and Leah across the river. Jacob stays behind. And at this particular instance, he wrestles with the Lord. Isn't that fascinating? So we see Jacob running from his life after deceiving his brother from the birthright and the blessing. He's running for his life from his father-in-law. And now he meets the Lord. And what does the Lord do? The angel of the Lord begins wrestling with him. All night. That's exhausting. Those of you who have wrestled before, that's a long time to be wrestling. And what's even greater than that is that Jacob won. The only reason that the angel of the Lord won is because he took his hip out of socket, which, quite frankly, that's cheating. Right? If we're going to be fair, you can't do that when you're wrestling. So here is Jacob, and he's wrestling with God, with the angel of the Lord. I give away my thoughts here. And he's trying to leave. This angel, the day is dawn. Then he said to him, look at this. Verse 26. Then he said, let me go, for the day is broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Isn't that fascinating? Then Jacob asked, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. Fascinating instance. But if you put it in perspective, Jacob is at a crossroads because literally he is fleeing because he thinks that Laban is about to kill him. So he's being chased by Laban on this side, and then he sends his favorite wife and children and his less than favorite wife and children all across the river. And while he is here, he is wrestling with this angel of the Lord. Again, he's at a crossroads in life, and we see divine intervention. And then in chapter 33, Esau arrives. So Laban's coming from this way, Esau's coming from this way, and we've got this wrestling match in the middle, and here we have the meeting of Esau. Now, you remember how they left? You remember how their relationship kind of ended? Esau didn't like Jacob very much. In fact, Esau said he was going to kill Jacob next time I see him. Not a very good place that you want to go back to. So here comes Esau, and it's reported back to Jacob that Esau is coming with 400 men. So how do you approach? Here's the crossroads of Jacob. How do you approach this? I rightfully have the birthright of my father, of our father. I rightfully have the blessing of our father. I am a rightful heir, and in fact, I am superior to you. So Jacob could arrive so pompously, and it kind of might maybe seem that's the way that he left the relationship, that I'm better than you. So he could arrive with Esau and his 400 men with arrogance and pomp and a haughty attitude. But I am convinced that God put him in this situation to arrive at the meeting with Esau with humility. His father-in-law just chased him down. Not just humility, but with confidence. Because he, the night before, wrestled with the angel of God and won. And therefore got another blessing. Your name shall be called Israel. So he arrives at this crossroads. He meets Esau in chapter 33. He meets Esau with confidence and humility because of this divine series of events that God has led him in. One more, time permitting, one more man in which the brothers are involved. We have Joseph meeting with 10 of his brothers. You remember, they wouldn't let Joseph's little brother come. Joseph meeting with the 10. If there is a story in the Bible where you can see the hand of God clearer, then I'm not necessarily aware of it. We can make an argument for several of them, but in the life of Joseph, God is there. There is no doubt that this is a divinely led man. And he is divinely led because of what God is doing in his life. Because this is a man, Joseph, and there's more written about Joseph than any other biblical character apart from Jesus. This is a man that should have been dead about 10 or 15 times over. So we pick up in Genesis very quickly. We pick up in Genesis chapter 37, I believe. And in Genesis chapter 37, where we pick up, we have Joseph having these dreams. He tells these dreams. He first tells these dreams to his brothers, right? Because he was gathering sheaves and his sheaves stood upright. And the brothers bowed down to his. Well, because of that, they hated him for it. And as he was coming down from the field, they said, hey, here comes this dreamer. They despised him because of his dreams. He also had a dream, and he told it to his mother and his father. And guess what? They didn't like it either. Jacob said, are your mother and I going to bow down to you also? The sun, moon, and 11 stars bow down to me. Well, because of their hatred, their brother's hatred, and again, just a recap, because of their hatred, they sold Joseph into slavery. After wanting to kill him, they sold him into slavery to make a little bit of money. As he was being sold to these slave traders as they were coming, the slave trader sold him to a man named Potiphar, you remember. Potiphar put him in charge of his house. And being in charge of his house, he was second in command of Potiphar's house. And guess what? Potiphar was an Egyptian. Keep that in the back of your mind. He was second in command of Potiphar's house. And his wife liked him. His wife, Potiphar's wife, told some lies about Joseph. And those lies got Joseph thrown into prison. But it's interesting because in prison, Joseph rose to power again, divinely led. And being in power, he sees the cupbearer and the baker of Pharaoh being thrown into prison as well. Nice to meet you. Guess what? They have dreams. Joseph interprets their dreams. Baker, you're out. Cupbearer, you're going back to the king. 3 days later, the cupbearer got restored and the baker got hanged. Then from prison, we see the meeting with the cupbearer. The cupbearer goes back to Pharaoh, and guess what? Pharaoh has a dream, and now the cupbearer begins to remember, oh yeah, I had a dream when I was in prison, and it came true. There was a man in prison that told me the dream, and it was exactly as he said. So Pharaoh calls from this Egyptian prison, because Potiphar was an Egyptian, calls Joseph to his house. Pharaoh tells him his dream. He interprets the dream. Pharaoh, again, Joseph is second in command. This is the third time where Joseph has risen to power in places where he has no business being. 3 times. So Pharaoh makes him second in command. And guess what? A divine intervention and a divine meeting. Here come his brothers. Because there's a famine in the land. And Egypt was the place that had food. Why did Egypt have food? It was because of Joseph. So his brothers, after selling him into slavery, after trying or wanting to kill him at least, they meet at last. And because his brothers arrive in Egypt, and because Joseph is in the place that he is in, think about this. All of that leads to Israel establishing themselves in Egypt. And because Israel establishes himself in Egypt, and because they are given this beautiful and luscious ground where they can shepherd their flocks, the people of Israel, they flourish. And guess what? Pharaoh, this new Pharaoh, they don't like it very much. And they begin to put them to hard labor. And because they put them into hard labor, again, you see the divine plan through this whole thing. Because they put them in hard labor, the people cry out to God. And because the people cry out to God, God answers with plagues. And because God answers with plagues, we have this exodus from Egypt. How? Why? Joseph. It all comes back to Joseph. There are several times in this instance, in the life of Joseph, where we see that God, through the whole thing, gets the glory over and over again. The dreams, that's God. That's God getting the glory. I mean, you see this entire last line, the Exodus, the plagues, the salvation, and the brothers, the Israel being established. All of that is God getting the glory. But there are several instances in this particular life, in this series of events, where Joseph has very important and critical decisions to make, life-altering crossroads. What if? You see everything that has happened. What if Joseph chose a different route? For instance, he gets sold into slavery. What if while he is in slavery, he decides not to work for his master? What if he decides to be a lazy, worthless man and do nothing? He wouldn't have risen to power in Potiphar's house. Hey, while we're talking about Potiphar, right? What if he gave in to Potiphar's wife? God wouldn't have gotten the glory from the Exodus in Egypt, would he have? Or what if while he was in prison, what if he put his head to the ground and he pouted and he refused to ever do anything good again? Because every time, after all, that he's done anything good, God has always punished him and put him in even a worse situation. What if he just put his head down and never did anything again? God wouldn't have gotten the glory, would he have? Or what if in the house of Pharaoh, I mean, he's got everything life possibly could offer. What if he forgot all about God? What if he forgot all about his brothers? What if he forgot about his family? What if he forgot? I mean, what if he gave up everything? Crossroads. Or while he's there, what if when his brothers came, he killed every single one of them? That's what they wanted to do to him. Probably what they deserved. What if he killed them? You look at the life of Joseph in this illustrious map that I've given you. All those series of events, Joseph has big, important decisions to make. If God is in the back of his mind instead of in the front of his mind, the nation of Israel might not exist. There might not have been an Exodus. God might not have gotten the glory, at least in the way that we know it to be. Crossroads. You've got decisions that you make on a daily basis. And as you face those decisions and you think about, what do I need to do? God lead me. Put God at the forefront of those decisions. My father instilled very early age this particular verse that, we studied on this morning in Bible class, Colossians chapter 3 and verse 17, and it will forever be ingrained in my mind. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. I'm convinced that needs to be the guiding principle to everything in our life. Everything that we do, let God get the glory. In every single aspect that you do. Hey, am I going to flip burgers? Absolutely. That's great. You be the best burger flipper that God ever made, and you let God get the glory from flipping burgers. Are you going to be a carpenter? You be the best carpenter that has ever been. Everything that you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. I think this was at the heart of what Joseph was doing in his decision making. I think I want to encourage you. You look at Colossians chapter 3 and verse 17. Let that guide you. Let it guide you this week and throughout your life, but especially as you go to work. Don't just go to work just to get a paycheck and to get by. Go to work to let God get the glory. Go to work to give thanks to God. Everything that you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus. But we're at Crossroads. And you might not be at a crossroads per se, big decision making, but every day we make little bitty decisions. And those little bitty decisions add up to big decisions later on. So make sure that in your life that your decisions are nothing but God-centered. That's my encouragement. That's my plea tonight. Let God be the center of your life. And if He's not, put Him there as we stand and as we sing.